Okay. Can you see that?
Well, I got a message saying recording in progress, and now I see live transcription, closed captioning has been enabled, right? We're good.
I think we're good.
Mhm.
And I have a backup. Okay, great. Okay, so we'll get going. So my name is Christie Lutz, and I am New Jersey Regional Studies Librarian and Head of Public Services in Special Collections and University Archives at Rutgers University Libraries in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Today is August 16th, 2022. We are here today with Ron Becker for an oral history project organized by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, otherwise known as MARAC, New Jersey Caucus. The project intends to document the history of MARAC as it marks its 50th anniversary. This interview is being recorded with the permission of all participants. Ron, could you just verbally confirm that you do indeed consent to the recording?
Yes, I consent to the recording.
Okay, thank you. So let's start off. Could you talk a little bit about your early life, sort of before we get into all your MARAC involvement and professional work over the years? Just tell us a little bit about where and how you grew up and your early childhood.
Okay, it was a very interesting and somewhat unique childhood, which I really enjoyed for the most part. I was born in 1950 of immigrant parents. They were both from Belarus. My mother had come from there in a little town called Lurna Vola, right on the Niemen River, and Lurna on one side, Vola on the other, and they kind of combined. I was a very large Jewish population. However, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. My mother immigrated at a very early age. She was a young teenager when she and an older sister came. They were sponsored by a cousin in the Bronx, and that's how she came to America. My father, unfortunately, stayed. He had a business there and was really connected to the whole society, figured nothing could ever happen to him, and unfortunately suffered terribly. His wife and his son were killed. He was imprisoned in Auschwitz and suffered in the Sonderkommando, which was the worst of the worst, the prisoners that worked in the gas chambers. Somehow survived that. He came to America. He was in a DP camp in Italy when a sister, an older sister of his who had immigrated to America early in the 20th century, called for him, found him on a list of survivors. And so he came to the Bronx, and what we call a shidduch in Yiddish was made with him and my mother. His sister said, you know, we have what were called landsmen. Those are people from the same town right here in the Bronx. Let's go visit them. And it turned out there was an unmarried daughter there, and he told his tale of woe to her parents, who became my grandparents, and an immediate match was made, and they were married within a week. And I came less than 9 months later. So and yet the marriage lasted. I mean, they respected each other. And so that was sort of the background of how I came about. My father was already well into his 50s. He was born in 1896 when I was born, and my mother was born in 1912. And we lived in the Bronx with my grandparents in a walk-up apartment. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. It was my grandparents, my parents, little me, and an unmarried brother. And that was during the week. So you can imagine how crowded this apartment was. And then on the Sabbath, on Friday night, came my mother's 2 sisters and their husbands. And one of them had a baby that was my age. And we all basically were in my memories from that are fighting for places on the bed, literally, you know, trying to hold on to my corner so nobody could kick me off the bed. This was not very, it was not to my father's liking, to say the least. He had survived the war, gone through all that. It just did not like that kind of a setup. So one day my mother is invited by a friend of hers, who's also from Belarus, from the town of Skittle, who also married a survivor. and the Jewish Agricultural Society had settled them in Vineland, New Jersey, on a poultry farm. And that was the Jewish Agricultural Society and the Baron de Hirsch Fund. And they invited my parents to a barbecue they were having there. My father goes down there and he said, "This is wonderful. We're seeing their fresh air and barbecue and a Yiddish-speaking community." My father never really learned English very well, so he just really felt at home. So without telling anybody in the family, the next day, instead of going to work in the clothing factory where he had a job as a presser, which is a very difficult job, they have the big irons that press the pleats and dresses and other clothing. So to him, it was like, it was certainly a step up from Europe, but not something he wanted to do the rest of his life. He was also commuting on the subway from the Bronx to Brooklyn. And my mother was working as a hand sewer at that time in the garment district. So anyway, without telling anybody in the family, he goes to the Jewish Agricultural Society offices in Manhattan and signs up for a farm. Comes home a couple hours later and says, "We're moving." It broke my grandparents' heart, to say the least. They were very upset, and my mother was bewildered. She hardly knew him. I mean, they got married after. Remember, they sort of knew each other in Europe. My father was so much older, and he was married, and she was a young girl when she left. So they didn't really know each other that well. All of a sudden, this guy is now taking me to this rural area, and it was rural. Mm-hmm. So we moved to Vineland, New Jersey when I was 2 years old. We did go back to New York a lot. My mother was homesick, and almost every weekend she'd get on the bus. And until I was old enough, I'd have to go with her. And my sister was born on the farm 2 years later. She was born in 1954. It was very hard work that my father did not anticipate, to say the least. Remember, he's like 56 years old by now, and to start all over again with chickens. And did nothing about the egg business. He knew a lot about the delicatessen business, which is what he was in Europe. But it was a very close-knit community, lots of friends there, and they got along, really incredibly well. There were a lot of ups and downs. There was very hard work on the farm, and which I got to do when I came of age, for sure. The chickens didn't stop laying eggs, and at first he didn't even have chicken coops. He had them out on the range, and going over a 5-acre property, and we basically lived in a shack, trying to find eggs. It was quite a job. So he built 3 large chicken coops. We eventually had between 10 and 15,000 chickens, which seems like a big farm, but compared to what the farms are today, it's just absolutely nothing. And it was a burgeoning community. Vineland had a large Jewish immigrant community. And so most of my friends were actually born in DP camps in Europe, my classmates in school and all that, and somehow made their way to the United States and to the farm. And I'm forever grateful to the Agricultural Society and to the Baron de Hirsch Fund, because not only did they settle us, give us an opportunity to make a living and for my parents to raise a new generation, but they also helped me in college a lot with student loans and scholarships. They were no interest loans, the ones that I got, and some were scholarships, and between that and scholarships I got from the university and all that stuff, I was able to go to a private university, not for free, but I was able to pay my debts very quickly. By the time I was 30, I was pretty much debt-free, which unfortunately is not the case with most children today. But it was an interesting upbringing. I went to a 2-room schoolhouse to begin with. Kindergarten and first grade was on the first floor. Second and third was on the second floor. And I didn't know a word of English when I started school, which was a little bewildering, but I wasn't alone. There were other kids in the same situation. And you pick it up like a sponge at that point. And it was kind of enjoyable. I still remember the names of my teachers. The only unfortunate thing that I remember was in first grade, because we shared the room with the kindergartners. And I didn't realize it when I was in kindergarten. When we went out to play for at least an hour, the first graders had to stay in and learn how to read. And so when I got to first grade, as soon as that, the opportunity to go to the playground, how I went running out, and I still remember some big burly person picking me up and carrying me back, kicking and screaming to learn how to read. But as you can see, I did learn how to read. And so those are my first couple years. And then the Edward R. Johnstone School was established in Vineland. It was the newest of the elementary schools, and it actually went up to fifth grade. Yeah, it was fifth grade, maybe even sixth grade. Actually, it was sixth grade, right? Because junior high was 7, 8, 9. So I finished my schooling, elementary schooling there. Then went to Memorial Junior High School, and then Vineland High School, and then off to college. But I was able to, participate in a lot of the school activities, but most of all, it was work on the farm. When we got home, we had to, before we mechanized certain things, before we got egg washers, we had to use basically sandpaper and clean off the eggs. And then we would have to candle them. We'd run them through and then shine a light on them and then weigh each individual egg. I mean, you consider we probably had certainly 5,000 to 10,000 eggs a day during the height of the farm operation. So it was a 4-person operation. When my sister became old enough, she was doing it too. And then we slowly were able to mechanize the farm. We got automatic feeders. So you could dump the feed in one area and go around, and automatic water troughs and things like that. Still had to collect the eggs by hand. Today, the chickens are in cages and they never leave the cage. The eggs go one way, the feed goes another way, the waste goes another way. It's incredible, but it was still very dirty work. There were 100 chickens to a room, as I recall. It was very dusty, very dirty. And there was method to my parents' madness. First of all, they needed us. But second of all, the idea was that they wanted to raise a new generation of professionals. God forbid you should tell them when you came of age that you wanted to continue the family farm. That whole Midwestern model of the multi-generation farm was not what they had in mind. In fact, we were the third wave of immigrants to live pretty much on the same land. The first came over in the 1880s and came from Eastern Europe, and many of them were Zionists. And the idea was they'd live off the farm and learn how to become good farmers and what have you, and then go to Palestine, go to Israel, and start life anew there. And then there was the wave that came over during the big immigration in the early 20th century, escaping anti-Semitism and all of that. And in each case, the farms, the children of the farmers became professionals, moved away or stayed in Vineland and became some kind of a professional and didn't keep the family farms going. And then I was in the third and the last wave, and that was the post-Holocaust wave to be settled there. And so it was a very interesting upbringing. We had in Salem County on the Morris River, it's spelled Maurice, but pronounced Morris. We had our own swimming hole with a bandstand, and our parents would take us there in the summer. And it was just a really interesting way to grow up. And again, I finished high school and then went off to Duke University and majored in history. Was fascinated by the social history was a real new and coming field at that time. And I really got involved in it, and I was determined that I would sort of become the historian of the common person, and not just the great white leaders and that kind of led me ultimately to archives. One little anecdote my mother used to say, and I said this when I won the Hughes Award, I remember, because the whole idea was that you'd raise these, the parents would sacrifice, and they sacrificed like crazy. I mean, it was incredible what they did for us to bring us up, starting with nothing. And they would always, the goal was that if you were a boy, you would become a doctor or a lawyer and live in Cherry Hill. If you were a girl, you would marry a doctor or a lawyer and live in what they pronounced it Cherry Hill. That was where the elite Jewish community lived. So one day, as an adult, my mother is kibitzing with some of her friends, and she doesn't realize that I'm overhearing this conversation. I was standing at the doorway, and they were bragging about their kids, which they used to do a lot. my son's a doctor, this, my son's a lawyer. So new Fraudel, my mother's name was Frida Fraudel. What does your son do? What's Stein's son? And says, well, he's not a doctor, he's not a lawyer, but he's some kind of professional. So I walked in right at that point, to her embarrassment. But that was kind of the mindset. And in most cases, it worked. I mean, we never thought for a second of disappointing them, regardless. And, they didn't really, in my case, I was very fortunate. They never pushed me other than to get good grades. And they never even knew what I was studying, but they knew what an A was and a B and all of that. And never tried to pull, even though my mother was a master at guilt trips. Like if you had to cold, somebody had to be blamed for everything. So if you had a cold, it's because you didn't wear a sweater, that kind of thing. But not the heavy duty stuff. And there was heavy duty stuff in our community. There were people who lost children in the Holocaust who were very, very accomplished, say accomplished musicians, what have you. And then when their kids didn't quite, the kids that they had in the United States, and my contemporaries didn't quite match up, they would even say stuff like, the wrong person survived, that kind of stuff, and really threw guilt trips. And there were a couple suicides among the people that I knew. But otherwise, it was a really nice community. We belonged to an Orthodox synagogue, a little shtibel, we called it, a little house of worship. My father was certainly an atheist by the time it came, but very connected to the Jewish community. He would come running if he was needed for something. So of course he still felt that. And he also felt very connected to the Italian community of Vineland and Cumberland County. Had many, many Italians who, in fact, Vineland was founded by Italians. It was founded by Charles Landis, who basically advertised in Italy to bring people over. It was going to be the great grape growing area. That's what's called Vineland. All the street names were of Italian names: Genoa, Cornucopia, and what have you, Palermo. A very planned community, planned just around the Civil War. And my father felt really akin to the Italians. And part of it was because he was in the DP camp in Italy, and he really fell in love with Italy. And despite the fact that he was kind of, surrounded by barbed wire and all that, he really enjoyed being there, and probably would have liked to have stayed in Italy if his sister hadn't called for it. He had no choice. If the whole idea of the DP camps was to find a permanent place for you to live somewhere in the world, and if somebody sent for you and you were within the quota of that country, you went. So after several years in the camp, he came to the United States, but he never forgot. In Italy, he loved opera and all of that. Could speak Italian and many other languages. English was the one language that he didn't particularly want to learn, because he was getting older, and they used to kid him, New Becker, if it was raised in this English, why don't you speak English? He says, the chickens understand me no matter what I say. So that was basically, that's a summary, of course, of my childhood. And, I still, did a lot of the normal stuff, still played sports, and was involved in clubs and stuff. And, pretty much enjoyed the childhood. It's a childhood that people don't really have anymore. Small town.
Really fascinating. Thank you. So you made your way to Duke, as you mentioned. How did you find Duke? How did you decide on Duke as where you were going to go to college?
I was inspired by a history teacher that I had. He actually went to Wesleyan and tried to get me to go there, but he told me where they were doing social history, where there'd be a good place for me to go. And he was really encouraging, even though my guidance counselors were not. Remember, in Vineland, very few people went to college. And the Vietnam War changed that a lot. By the time I was in high school, the county college system had started, and one of the reasons for its rapid development, in fact, they were meeting in chicken coops in Cumberland County College, to give people at least a 2-year draft deferment. And so the idea was almost everybody that went to college would go to Glassboro, That was which is now Rowan University.
Mhm.
But you go there and be a teacher. That would be like the most you could aspire to. And the guidance counselors were not particularly, big on, those things. Oh, you'll never get into a place like that. Well, being a chicken farmer's son with the quotas and things like that, I probably was a unique applicant. I didn't get into Wesleyan, but I did get into Duke, and I had a scholarship, and then I applied for scholarships from any place I could from the Jewish organizations, and that's how I landed up there. It was a pretty interesting place to be. It was different, that's for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
Remember, I started there right after, shortly after the Civil Rights Act was passed. So I didn't really know a lot about the South, even though that part of North Carolina was much more liberal than most of the South. But still, I came across like African American servants, that type of thing, because in New Jersey, the race didn't really, you could be a hotel cleaner, whether you're white or black or anything there. And then also it was just, you'd walk down the street and an older person, here I am, a teenager, good morning, sir.
Mm.
And I just couldn't believe that, but I did get very involved in, in the political life of that area as well. And it was very meaningful. I was very naive going in, didn't understand a lot of things. But for the election in 1968, I got very involved in that. I was one of those that stayed clean for Eugene McCarthy, very, anti-war and all that. I didn't understand the Great Society at all. And that's probably why that is the focus of really all that I read and write about now in history. Lyndon Johnson, who I thought was this horrible warmonger. To me, if it wasn't for the Vietnam War, they'd probably one of the great presidents. I mean, there was more progressive legislation passed then, than ever.
Mhm.
But I stayed clean for Gene to try to, and didn't understand about Hubert Humphrey's background and all he had done in the civil rights movement. So we did a lot of protesting. I think we only took final exams, maybe 2 out of the years that I was there. They were always canceled because of the unrest in the spring, the student protests and all of that. But our president was Terry Sanford, and he had been a former governor. And I remember when he was inaugurated, there was a lot of protest, thinking that he was using the Dwight Eisenhower model to try to become president. He had already run as a favorite son for president. That he'd go from the Senate to being president, to being president of the university, to then going back into politics, and to become a senator, governor, president of Duke, and then ultimately a senator. But he was a really big change from the president that we had before. Who basically just could not take the student protests at all. There was a march to his house, I remember. Instead of facing the students, Douglas Maitland Knight was his name. He escaped to New Jersey and eventually became a corporate president. I think it was RCA. And then Sanford became president. But Sanford, he ate his meals with the people. He was with the students and just seemed to be very close to everybody. And he when I met President Gross, Mason Gross at Rutgers, when I came there, he reminded me so much of Sanford, as someone who really cared about students and whose presence was always on the campus. And didn't jump to call in police whenever things got bad. So one day we were going to, in one of the protest movements, one of the protests that we did, we were going to take over, if you know the Duke campus, there's this big traffic circle. There's 5 little roads that come from it. And if you can commandeer that circle, you've shut down the university. And so a bunch of kids, and I was a bystander. I wasn't doing any of the criminal stuff, but I was certainly participating as a bystander. They were getting twigs together, branches, and they were going to set it on fire. And so Sanford shows up and basically calls us a bunch of white middle-class cowards, selfish. And what he did was he says, I've got another idea for you. And he handed us voter registration forms, big stacks of them, and got us to go out into basically what was a shanty town. Remember, Durham was a pretty substantial city. Durham was the county seat of Durham County. It was the home of Duke University. It was the home of Central Carolina University, which was a large African-American school, one of the early ones. It was the home of the American Tobacco Company, which the Duke family ran, and Ligon and Myers. And, you know, the tobacco industry was riding high at that point.
Mhm.
And here in this town, there were people, there were dirt roads, outhouses, you name it. And these were people who had never voted before, who really weren't permitted to vote, at least maybe legally, but not practically. You know, remember in the Old South, the voter tests and all of that. And we'd knock on their doors and try to get them to register, you know, for that election. And it was just really something to see. They were afraid of us. It was like, go away, don't, you know, I don't want trouble. So it was a real eye opener. It got me to really look at things a little more seriously, to really look at the campaign and look at what Hubert Humphrey was really all about. And yes, to study the Vietnam War a little bit more, to understand why. And so I was able to escape the draft thanks to that. My father already told me there's no way you're ever going to serve. You're going to go to Canada if you're drafted. And I came pretty close. My class was the first one in the draft lottery, and I was number 212. And I think they drafted up to about 180 something that year. It was after I guess the 10th offensive had occurred, right? So it was after that, but it was still, I'd be in harm's way to say the least. So, you know, again, a lot of unfortunate people. I still remember the joke they made of it. It was a big TV program, and they had these pretty girls would be dipping their hands into like a jar to pick a date, and there was bands playing and all of that. We had a party at my dorm, and we collected money, probably like $1 a piece, and the loser, the person who got called first, would get the pot. And I remember the person who got the first draft number was going to medical school, was going to get a deferment. So there was a big argument over whether he should get the money or not. I don't remember how it was settled. But I was able to award it that way. And I took my studies a lot more seriously after that. We went to graduate school and really got into that period. And as you know, ultimately we got the Harrison Williams papers at Rutgers, and Williams, as it turns out, was the Great Society senator. He was the chair of the committee that drafted all of the legislation. He was Johnson's man, you know, in the Senate. So it kind of came around full circle.
And that leads me to ask, you know, why you're getting this amazing sort of political and social education in Durham. I think a lot of us who went into archives had sort of a spark or something, we saw something, we went into a rare book room, something kind of kicked off that, oh, what is this with archives? Did you have one of those moments?
Exactly, right. Just doing research for a paper. The person was so helpful, who was helping me. I was in, you know, the manuscripts reading room. And I also, in my senior year, I was given a carrel in the library. Duke had closed stacks. So that was like a big thing. I was given all these privileges that a graduate student would have, or faculty members. I really kind of enjoyed that. But the person was helping me. And finally, I was thinking to myself, because I had no idea what I was going to do for a living or anything. I mean, my basic thing was, you know, to enjoy myself in college. And I did enjoy the social aspects and all of that. And to be involved in the political life, certainly, of the area, and to stay out of the draft. Those are my ambitions. I had no idea what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And so I asked the person who was helping me, I said, like, you know, do they pay you for this? Because I had no idea. He was a young person. He said, sure. I said, well, what do you have to do to get a job like that? He said, probably what you're doing. You know, a good background in history. There was no such thing as archival certification or archival education that early on, although I was one of the very first people to get an archival education. But from that moment on, I thought, gee, this is a good idea. But in the meantime, I think I'll go to graduate school. And that's how I landed up at Rutgers. So, again, I got some funding and it was a good deal.
Okay.
And so I figured, let me go back, be back to my home state. I'll be closer to my parents, who are by now, they're pretty elderly. Probably not as old as I am now, but they're getting up there by that point.
So all right, so you came to Rutgers and did your archival education. And then how did you sort of land your first professional position?
Okay, so, well, there was very little archival education then. So I got a master's degree in history and then did an MLS there as well, a library degree, and which was much more oriented towards traditional librarianship then, and you could do a lot. It was an interesting program that we had at Rutgers, but my archival education was at a program that no longer exists. It was called the Archives History Institute. It was sponsored by the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus, Ohio. It was for an entire summer. I can't remember the exact dates. I could probably figure that out. Probably something like 1972, probably the summer of 72. And so I went out there and I met a lot of people who were already working in the field. And one of them became a very close friend, Michael Plunkett. And Mike is the one that told me about there was a group of people in the Northeast and the North Central, the North East Central, the Mid-Atlantic region, that were getting together to try to form an organization. And that's how I found out about MARAC. And we started that year. That fall was the first meeting. And I was working part-time in special collections at the time. I had always had, I was one of the first work study students at Duke. And because I was kind of athletic and I played basketball and all that in high school, when I saw the various jobs you could have, I never thought of the library when I was a freshman, 17-year-old, who knows what's. So I chose being an intramural basketball referee. And so that was my intramural, my work study job. I think I got maybe 50 cents or $1 a game. And boy, I was the only ref in this game. So you were running back and forth. I learned how to make quick decisions. People are in your face, and some of them were real athletes. There were many varsity football players that were playing, real basketball and all that. They're big, tough guys. And you just have to blow that whistle and make a decision really fast. And then as I'm running the other way, I realized, yeah, I really blew that one. I'm going to have to now do something for them. So I learned a lot about compromise and all of that. But it was not something that was going to lead to anything. So when I got to Rutgers and was given, as a graduate student, given the choice of being a work study student, I chose the library. That's how I met Don Sinclair and the folks in special collections. And so I worked there part-time. Also taught a class early at Livingston College, which was just starting up around that time. It was really interesting, but decided I really was not into, it was kind of almost a remedial US history class. I really was more interested in the research aspect of it at the time, although later on I really enjoyed what teaching I did. So that was sort of the spark at that point, and then getting educated there. And then the first job, I'm embarrassed to say there were many jobs available then. There was a lot of federal money and I had a lot to choose from. And I ultimately went to the New Jersey Historical Society after getting a job offer from the New York Public Library. I almost got an incredible position. I was a finalist for the job, the head of the Immigrant Archives at the University of Minnesota. This is a person with no experience, essentially. It was just graduate student experience. But I had a connection there. One of my professors, John Pasco, was the graduate school roommate at Ohio State of Rudy Vicoli, who was a professor at Rutgers and then went on to Minnesota he wrote the definitive book on immigration in New Jersey, which we have. It's one of those 1964, anniversary series there.
Yes.
So he did Vocoli well, wrote a letter of recommendation. I mean, I really did deserve to get that. And it would have been a tough thing to do too, because, you know, we were about to get married and all that. And I'd be pulling my wife away from everything she knew, you know, in New Jersey, pretty much like my father took my mother away from her family. So I settled on the New Jersey Historical Site, was close by and all that. And I really enjoyed that position. I had for a little bit over a year. It didn't pay very well. I think it was $8,100 a year. It seemed like a lot to me then. Chris was making a lot more than me as she worked in the trademarks department of J&J in New Brunswick as a secretary there. And she knew languages very well. Her job was to basically read the Latin American press looking for trademark violations. So she could be reported and the lawyer could go down there and sue them. Not a very satisfying job. She'll end up taking a big pay cut to come back to Rutgers and become the secretary in the Judaica department, which was much more satisfying than what she was doing. But I held that position for about a year. And of course, I knew the people at Rutgers very well. So that when a position came up at Rutgers, I got it. I don't remember applying for it. I possibly might have. And it was kind of nice because it was, first of all, it was a big salary increase. I think it was $12,000, which is a big jump over 8,000. And you had automatic like pay increases and all of that. And there was faculty status and what have you. I remember the negotiation. You'd go in and see the director at the New Jersey Historical Society, and he'd tell you what a great year you were and how wonderful you are. We're going to give you a $100 raise. And so of course, after all that, you complain. And he says, well, such and such was, you know, he's willing to work for so much less than you are. What makes you think you're so special? And it's like, I didn't really want to have a career where I had to do that every year. So that was very attractive. And so that was the beginning of a 40+ year career at Rutgers. It never occurred to me at that point that it was going to last that long. It did.
It did, and you were head of special collections for how many years?
25 years, I think. Around 1990 was it? It was a lot of years. I retired in 2016, so yeah, about 25 years.
So pop back to the beginning of your career. You had mentioned sort of the start of MARAC. And that's, you know, something I'd love to hear about, really those early days of MARAC and your early involvement and just how things sort of grew from there.
Right. So my first impression, without ever having been to any professional meetings of any kind, from what people were telling me in Ohio when I was there, was that SAA was really an elitist organization, and that you really can't learn anything from it, that all the sessions were geared towards people in the National Archives or state archivists of big states and that type of thing. And there was no real archival education available anywhere except for the program that we were in Ohio, and that was just a summer. It was a good program. I mean, we learned a lot. We had some good teachers, and we also spent time in not only in Ohio with the Ohio Historical Society, which was very progressive. Then they had a huge staff, and I think they ran the State Museum as well. And they gave us a week in Cleveland at the Western Reserve Historical Society, which was also a really good experience. I really enjoyed being in Cleveland. So I thought Columbus was, you know, it was a great place to be in terms of archival education, but it was a very, very hot, humid summer, and everything was football. Woody Hayes was their football coach, and every single, I still remember the newspaper, the headlines of all the papers had to do with the football team, and whether somebody had a cold or was hurt, and they're not even playing yet. This is summer, you know, preparing to play. But it was a good period. Sorry for that aside.
It always comes back to football, Ron.
Yeah, right. Yes, I know that. So
so
So anyway, I learned that this would be a way to get practical education. So then I made sure that I would go to the first conference. And my friends that I met over there made sure I would go too. I remember Mike really pushed me hard, Mike Plunket. He was the manuscripts curator at the University of Virginia at the time. It was my age, maybe a couple years older. And we met at the training place. So I go to this meeting not knowing exactly what to expect, and was just enthralled. The enthusiasm and the level of education, it was so practical. I mean, like literally, you know, I'm sure you've heard the lard can story. If you haven't, it was like, how do you like a document that's damp or that's, you know, that, you know, how do you humidify a document? How do you like and they at University of Virginia, they did a big demonstration with the lard can and putting it over that. And here's when you get a collection, here's how you process it, and here are the levels of processing. And, you know, again, it was a much simpler world. There were no computers at all at that point, but everything was practical. How to deal with donors, how to do this, how to do that, how to do a deed of gift. What are the pitfalls? You know, how to stay out of some of these traps. And it was just amazing. And just again, the camaraderie. We met at the old Hotel DuPont, which was probably not as luxurious as it was originally. It was a little shabby. And the thing I remember was that there was a convent right nearby. Excuse me. And we had our meals there, and the nun served us. I remember. All right. So that part was also enjoyable, getting to know them, and it just was just a very practical, very informal, very different from what I was led to believe that SAA was. And again, I did. The one part I remember, Michael and I we were both having money problems, I remember. And so a lot of people were going out to eat and all that. I remember there were people from National Archives, people that were better off than we were, that were attending this as well. It wasn't just us. There were a number of very high level people from the, you know, Herb Finch and Elsie Freeman and lots of people from there. And, you know, they would ask people to go out to eat and all of that. And Michael and I couldn't do it. So we roamed Wilmington. And I remember we walked into a not so good neighborhood and we landed up eating dinner at a Gino's. I still remember that, believe it or not, after all those years. It's amazing what you remember. And then feeling a little out of place, but we made it back okay. And then another memory was as we were getting ready to leave, we were gathered in the, I guess, the lobby of the hotel. It's a really grand hotel. When a person who claimed to be Richard Nixon's brother, and as it turned out was Richard Nixon's brother, Ed Nixon, who was campaigning and trying to get our votes. So again, that was for the 72 election, which of course he won. And that's why I do remember that vividly, and just remember all the people that I met and knew that I wasn't in this alone. Because that's, you know, before that it was just, you know, it was Rutgers and you know, we did have it. The New Jersey Historical Commission was just getting going, and I got to know many of the people there early on, but it was still very much New Jersey centric, and didn't really know a lot of people. Didn't even know who the people at Princeton. You know, so that's all I got involved. It took MARAC to get us together, and SAA wasn't really kind to us at first. But I think we helped transform SAA, and eventually we became very close to them. And if you look at the SAA program now, it is much, and you compare it to programs, say, before the early to mid 1970s, it is much more geared towards the workaday, everyday archivist. And so I think we played a very important role. And I think I played personally an important role in getting the two organizations together during the time that I was chair.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about being chair of MARAC? Is there...
Right. Well, it wasn't a real big thing at that time. I don't even know what I did to deserve doing that. I was the chair of our meeting in Newark in 1974. It was the first time we met in New Jersey. And I guess I did a good enough job that people went, and I guess I might have been on the steering committee at that point as well. So again, it was a great place for a young, I was in my 20s then. It was a great place for a young archivist to, to get experience in organizational skills and things like that. So I remember we met in Newark, and again, the idea was it had to be cheap. Our registration fees had to be cheap. The hotel had to be cheap. Newark at that time essentially had one hotel, the Robert Treat Hotel, and the hotel that's now the Gateway one. I think it's a Hilton now, but it was a downtowner then. It was a chain called the Downtowner chain, and they were building it right by the train station. So they had a little office. They had a little cubicle there by the train station. And I literally went back and forth negotiating, first with getting a price from one, then getting a price from another, back and forth, until the Robert Treat said, there's no way I can match that. You'll have to go with the Downtowner. Now, the problem with the Downtowner was it hadn't been built yet. And so I was taking a big chance, and I got very, very lucky. It got done just in time. We were one of their first meetings. And we put on a pretty good program. I remember it was in the fall of '74, and Newark at that time still had a long way to go in terms of its being rebuilding. And its reputation was very bad, and so people would be afraid to go. And we had the slideshow we put on to try to convince people, and the highlight was our midnight tour of Newark. That we were going to dispel all the fears of Newark. And it was led by Charles Cummings, the late Charles Cummings of blessed memory. And we went around, very late at night, and all the churches stayed open. The ministers would greet us, and all the historic buildings. We went all around the city, and afterwards landed up in the Ironbound and kept the Ironbound open basically that night because there were so many of us. And people got to really, eat some unique food, some unique Portuguese and Brazilian food. And so really got to learn what Newark really was. Because
that's amazing.
The Downtowner was not very helpful, I'll tell you. That their slogan was, have your New York meeting in New Jersey, paying New Jersey prices without having to set foot in Newark. Because you got off the train and went through the walkway and you go right there. You'd never have to leave, and step on Newark City property. You go right from the train station. It was, a horrible commercial. And yet we were able to pull it off and set foot in Newark. We had a reception at the New Jersey Historical Society, which at that time was in uptown Newark on Broadway. So after spending the year, and I was still at the Historical Society, and that was just before I started it. Now, the preparation for the meeting, I switched jobs right in the middle of preparing for. I was already at Rutgers by the fall of '74. I started at Rutgers in July. So right in the middle of the preparation for MARAC. And so I think people left with a little bit of a good appreciation for New Jersey and for Newark. For that matter, people who never would. There were New Yorkers, lots of archivists from New York that had never been in Newark. That came to the meeting. So,
go ahead if you.
Yes, you had asked about, being chair and all that. So I was elected chair shortly after that. It was '75, and one of the things I did right away was try to make peace with SAA. There was a committee that got started right around then of all the regional, it was called the Regional Archives Committee or something of SAA. And so I represented us on that committee. And then I arranged to have meetings in large cities. One was in Washington, the first one was in Philadelphia, I think, and the next one was in Washington on consecutive years. At the same time that SAA was meeting there. I think they were meeting in the Northeast consecutive years in Philadelphia and Washington. And what we would do is they would have their meeting, which would be during the week, and their meeting would end just as ours was beginning. And we would they agreed, and Ann Morgan Campbell was their executive director, and I was negotiating with her, and they agreed to allow MARAC people who were not members of SAA, which included many MARAC people, to just stay there and attend the SAA meeting under the same registration fee, which might have been $5 or $10 back then, that they paid, and they could go to all the SAA sessions and be registered for the SAA meeting. Of course, many of them joined SAA as a result, and it was a great experience. We did it 2 years in a row. So up until, say, Thursday night, they'd be at the SAA meeting, and then it would turn into MARAC. And so we ran our program. And of course, it really swelled our membership, which was not, I think, maybe even when I left office, I think we were up to like 300, which we thought was a lot at that point. And a lot of it, I think, was due to people discovering us through that. So I think that was one of the better accomplishments of that time, making peace between them and working better. And I did get a little involved in SAA. I chaired the Congressional Records Committee. And again, it's because we had so many big congressional collections that I got involved with that. I was involved with the manuscript repository section that they had. I can't remember at what level, but I know I think I did one of their programs. My heart was always with MARAC when it came to archival professional organizations. That's where I started, and I really grew up with MARAC. And stayed on with it. And then after my presidency, I got talked into editing the newsletter, not knowing that your punishment was that you had to find your own successor. You couldn't just resign. But again, that was a really rewarding experience too, because I got to find out what everybody was doing and trying to gather news. And again, it was during the real early computer days where things could be done on a computer, but it was still before desktop publishing, and we were cutting and pasting, and it was the production part was so difficult that I had asked the organization to come up with some kind of a production editor. And so we did that, and that was a good experience. So I didn't have to do any of that. I would just gather the news, so to speak.
And you were also New Jersey Caucus chair for a time.
Right. That was probably when I was on. That was probably just before I became chair. I know I was on the steering committee. It probably was as New Jersey Caucus chair. And again, got to know a lot more about New Jersey too through that. Trying to encourage people to join and all that. Again, we were much smaller. But it was a great time because our field was exploding at that point. I mean, there was lots of money. There was an incredible amount of grant money, which I got to take advantage of a lot. And after a lot of missteps and trials and errors, I became pretty good at it to the point where I was on a lot of boards, including federal, review boards and all of that, having been so successful. Getting federal funding, and of course that all dried up later on. But I really started during the heyday of archives. I think it was the heyday of social history. I think it was the whole idea of, for the first time, understanding that like what real people think and how they react to the world around them is important. So diaries become important, family papers become important. Not just the papers of our leaders, the great white men, so to speak, women's collections become important. And we got very much involved in. And I was in a position where I was really given so much leeway in terms of collecting that I could start to bring these collections in. And some of them, the trouble with those and getting these organizational papers too, private organizations and volunteer organizations and things like that, they're big. Like when you get the League of Women Voters Archives and you get the Consumers League and all this and that, and these other big collections, there's nobody there to process them. And I was guilty of bringing these things in with no idea on how I was going to get them to the public. And so we were so fortunate that the federal government especially had all these great grant programs, some of which are still there. The NHPRC started around that time. The big one was the federal Title II-C grant run by the Department of Higher Education. We got big grants from them, covering a lot of our big collections. And again, we were so successful that I ended up getting put on the review board, where they locked us up in a hotel room in Washington, right around DuPont Circle. And there was a hotel that we stayed at, and we do our deliberations, there. We got HPRC grants. We also won Save America's Treasures. We were able to do that. And in many ways, it was kind of the explosion, the technology explosion that took away some of the funding. I still remember Al Gore was vice president at the time when he basically put an end to the title, or he redirected the Title II-C program to technology grants, not necessarily even based on history. And so that was the end of what I called that gravy train. But I really learned just the art of selling your case, selling why your material was important, not taking anything for granted. Because even though you knew that a program was really good, I remember as a reviewer, if they didn't explain it properly, if it was just written, it's just like, we're great, you've got to fund us, and they wouldn't get funded. So and then I got to meet a lot of people, during all those, and just in, just working in the field, incredible. It gave me an opportunity to meet so many interesting, important, people that, important or not important, famous or not famous, but just the experiences in Washington, dealing with a major labor union, getting to meet the higher echelon of the International Labor Union, how they operated and all of that. And then, of course, meeting so many members of our congressional staffs and the congressmen and senators themselves. It's
And
an incredible experience.
And you've really been a huge advocate for collections and history and New Jersey history. And do you have any standout experiences from you going to Washington or?
Yeah, well, some of my experiences, of course, the most memorable are in New Jersey, because I was somehow selected to be the spokesperson for the history community during the budget hearings that took place in the Assembly and the Senate. And so you'd get to testify for 3 minutes, I recall, unless you were interrupted. So the idea was to say something just controversial enough that one of them would wake up and interrupt you. Because you'd look at the panel, you'd look at the Appropriations Committee, and they're half dead. They're sitting there, they're half asleep. Yeah, you give a written transcript. If you Google my name, you'll see some of the transcripts of some of the speeches that I gave there. But I do have some specific memories that were really interesting because, they were always looking to cut the budget of the New Jersey Historical Commission. And, and I told them just how important these history grants was and how important history was to our understanding. And I still remember a couple of occasions. Once where I actually quoted Winston Churchill. I don't remember the exact quote, but I got interrupted and somebody said, Mr. Becker, what hospital should I close so that you can get your history money? So I quoted from Churchill during the war, where Churchill was being excoriated for supporting the British Museum at the same time London was being bombed. How can you do that? Waste, our federal resources. And that gentleman is why we're fighting this war. So I tried to say that they're both important. I was never saying that we should close hospitals. The idea was to expand. I said, that's your responsibility. He said, where are we going to get the money? I said, well, that's your responsibility. And then another one that I remember a lot was I was, making my impassioned speech. Nobody was listening to me except Senator Littell. You remember him? It was quite a while ago. He was from Sussex County, the northernmost part of New Jersey. And he interrupted me right in the middle. And said, hey, I know you. You're the guy who got that. It was a New Jersey Zinc Company, that collection of the mine and the mine in Sussex County. And boy, it couldn't have been a better question. I couldn't believe it. So he basically said, how's that going? I said, rather poorly because we don't have any funding. process. He says, "Oh, why not?" And then I said, "Well, like I just said, we have a limited budget at Rutgers, and where we really need money is in more general operating support outside. It's great, it's great to get these grants for really sexy collections that we can say have international importance and all that. But to do the bread and butter job, we need to have general operating support, and the New Jersey Historical Commission has a new program that's doing that. And whether that made a difference in the long run or not, I'm not sure. But when Barbara Buono was the chair of that committee, we had a lot of progress. She was my neighbor at the touch, and our kids went to school together, so we knew each other very well. And so I never hesitated to meet with her, and she certainly helped a lot. And so we stayed, we kept our funding. We eventually got that poison pill law that was passed. Well, first of all, we got the big funding that was done for the commission. And then during the McGreevey administration, that money was essentially taken away and put in the general fund. It was the hotel motel tax that we fought so hard to get. And we pretty much lost almost all of it the very next year, very quickly on, and felt very betrayed. And in the hearings, we concentrated on that. And we got the state senator, who is now a congressman. His name will come to me in a minute. He's the one that just changed parties from Democrat to Republican.
Yes.
He was on the Appropriations Committee then, and we got him to sponsor the poison pill legislation. He was horrified that we passed this whole big tax. New Jersey was practically the only state in the country where you could stay in a hotel for like 3 or 4 days and have your bill all on one page because there was no extra taxes. You just paid the regular sales tax, and that was it. Every other state, it's tax for this, for that, for that. And so we were able to get it was a sales tax on entertainment and hotels and motels and that type of thing. And we were getting pretty much all of that, for history and for culture. The State Museum was going to get money, and all. I did get money that first year. So a poison pill means that if the idea is that a certain percentage of that money must always be used for the purpose it was originally passed. And it was passed as a referendum by the people. It was that had to be, I think, an amendment to the Constitution to do that. So, so it was a very small percentage that was finally picked, but the bill that this state senator had put forward had to, basically, the Poison Pill Act said that if the purpose of the tax is no longer given for that, if the tax is no longer collected for the purpose it was originally brought in for, it is null and void. And so, of course, the legislators didn't want that, so it passed pretty easily. The trouble was we only got, I think, about 20% of it. So, but it still was, you learn a lot about how the political system works and all of that when you get involved that way. And we were able to say that, and it looks like it's in pretty good standing. I just happened to notice the grant cycle of this year from the Historical Commission, and they're still giving a pretty substantial amount out. And I see that Rutgers got a nice 6-figure allotment, thank goodness, this year. But that was always in danger every year, especially when the governor changed or the legislators changed. There was always a fight to do that. And that's a really interesting experience at those hearings. I didn't do much in the way in Washington, except for one case. There's called the indirect funding or directed fund. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's basically pork. It's money that individual congressmen and senators are able to get for projects in their districts, and Rutgers participated in this heavily. And for years and years, I would make any faculty member was allowed to apply to be able to lobby in Washington for that. And what I really wanted to do, what I wanted to lobby was for, first of all, for congressional papers to become public property. They're now private. But more importantly, that federal money could be used to process congressional papers. Because they were considered private property, the federal government felt no desire at all to fund them. They all went to other institutions. They didn't stay. Very few of them stayed at the National Archives. The only part of the senator's papers, for instance, that would stay at the National Archives would be if the senator was on a committee or chaired a committee, the committee records would go to the National Archives, but everything else was considered private. And that's like Congress liked keeping it that way. They like to police the judiciary and the executive. The Presidential Papers Act came out a little bit earlier before that time. And so they required, those papers were all public and required to be kept. As you know, there's a really big brouhaha with the Trump papers now.
Yes.
Over that goes directly back to the Presidential Papers Act. But the legislators' papers are all private. So my idea was there should be funds in Congress, that we should be given a fund at Rutgers to process and make available all of the New Jersey delegation papers we had. And I mentioned the importance of some of them. Mm-hmm. And by then we'd gotten the Harrison Williams papers and the Clifford Case papers, and also Fenwick, and so on, people that were real national figures. And so I finally was able to get permission to do that. So here I go to Washington now as a lobbyist. I'm now a real lobbyist. Rutgers chose 3 every year. It took me a while to get approved. I got approved 2 years in a row. So I was able to do this for 2 years unsuccessfully because there was a big backlash against wasteful spending in Congress those years. And some real disdain for legislators who got all this pork, as it was called. Except it was, of course, that pork that made legislatures make deals. And I got to learn a lot about making deals and all that, and how one gets things. I would go and visit somebody who was on the subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, say in the House of Representatives. I would visit that person and try to lobby for this, for this thing. Could you, get this committee to appropriate so many hundreds of thousands of dollars for Rutgers to do this for your own papers? And the guy was clearly not listening to me. In fact, he pawned me off to one of his assistants. Finally, he said, "Okay, I've heard enough." He said he had a bill, a very similar, a bill again for pork for his district in his state. And he basically said, "I want you to take this to," and I can't remember, it was the New Jersey representative, I think it was Frelinghuysen, who was on that subcommittee. Tell him that if he votes for this, I'll vote for your thing. And it was like, wow. And this was a Democrat telling me to take it to a Republican, and do all that. I mean, they did all this trading. And in fact, that's what Harrison Williams was known for. I mean, got really right-wing Republicans to vote for progressive legislation. A lot of it was horse trading. This is best for the people. So if you do this, I'll help you with that. We'll get that dam built in your state, so I really learned a lot about politics. And I remember doing a seminar for the entire New Jersey delegation, all of the 2 senators and all of the Congress people, about their papers. First of all, basically, how to keep their papers and all that. Please use one of, because they have fairly large budgets for staff. Have one of your staff person be an archivist, among other things. You have to take care of this so that you don't hand over totally unorganized stuff. And then putting in a plug. I didn't want to put too much of a plug in for Rutgers because we'd be overwhelmed if we got everybody's papers. But so that I did have that experience. I totally failed. We never got a penny. Neither did the other projects at that time. And then ultimately the whole thing was outlawed. And I understand it's back now. There is what they call indirect funding, or I forget exactly what they call it. But there is pork is back in the
It's back.
back in the equation. So again, it was an incredible experience. And where else would I have gotten experience like that? Just being just as lowly archivist, that goes around. And even now, I mean, just think of that, just the importance of the National Archives. They're the ones that started this whole thing with the Trump papers. That never would have happened. And from the National Archives say, wait a second, we're missing such and such.
Yeah, it's something. But that, that's fascinating. It's such a, you've had these fascinating experiences like that. And that kind of leads me into all the awards you've won for your work and your advocacy and being a real advocate of New Jersey history, including the MARAC Distinguished Service Award, the Roger McDonough Librarianship Award from New Jersey Studies and various other organizations, and a whole list in front of me that I can't possibly get through. But is there any recognition or award you've won that you're particularly proud of?
Well, first of all, a lot of these are just basically longevity awards. If you're around someplace long enough, you start. I've noticed that, but I'm really thankful for all of them, and it's great to be recognized by your peers. And of course, getting that New Jersey Historical Commission award after all those years was big. Yes, the MARAC award, and really all of them. But one of which it's a fairly minor one, but that I'm proud of because it actually rewarded me for some of the research that I've done. As most of it had to do with kind of leadership, and that was the award that the Society of Georgia Archivists gave. I think it was for an article that I wrote for Provenance for their journal.
Yes.
They give an award, I guess, for the best, I think every 3 years for the top article or something for that time. It's the Gracie Award. David Gracie was an archivist from there who I knew early in my career, an earlier generation. So that was a surprise. And I know I published a couple articles in their journal. I always just really like their editorial staff. And
which, what article, or could you talk a little bit about the article that
I don't remember which one it was for. Does it say?
If I can.
Because I wrote one on ethics, I remember, which was because the SAA had just come out with a new statement on archival ethics and showed how I applied it to, to running the archives that we had. And what was the other one?
Well, I think it was in 1997.
I'm sure I could look it up and find out.
Yeah.
I know I published that one. The one on partisan review, I think I published in the American Archivist. But there was another one I thought was an important one, and now I can't, somehow it's slipping my mind. I should have that. Maybe we can add it to the transcript later.
We can add it. We could do a follow-up.
Right. But anyway, that kind of award was also something that I cherish. And I have a bunch of them bookcase back there that use pictures. So it is again, it's mostly longevity, but I still appreciate it nonetheless.
Well, and speaking of longevity too, in retirement, you've been extremely active in Florida and in your community in Newport Richey. Would you like to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, they do. It's amazing how they discover you. I think part of that has to do with Googling and the internet. But first of all, I've tried to stay at least semi-active in the New Jersey community. And again, one of the, just to go back a little bit, something I'm proud of was the Educator of the Year Award that I got from the National History Day, New Jersey's National History Day. Since I'm not a high school teacher or a middle school teacher, I was the first archivist to get that award. But I think that Fernanda Perron has gotten it since then.
Yeah.
It's again, just, it exemplifies how we got involved with, I really believe in archives for everybody. We got involved with National History Day from the day it started. And that is working with young children and teaching them about archives and and helping them with projects, and then eventually being on the judging team for those projects. And I'm doing that now in Florida as well, by the way. I
Okay.
just did a whole bunch of National History Day projects here in Pasco County. In retirement, I had served much earlier, on the library board in Metuchen. This goes back to the 70s and 80s. And so I don't remember how it came up, but I was talking to somebody and it mentioned that before long I was invited to join the library board here in Newport Richey. And so got on that board. And then when there was a vacancy on the county library board, I guess, there's this retired librarian in Newport Richey who knows a lot about this, and especially, fundraising and lobbying and all that. They do a lot of lobbying in Tallahassee for the county and the municipal libraries. So I got involved in that, and I'm now chair of the municipal board, so a little bit more, which over here requires you to attend city council meetings, which has been really interesting. Things are very different. It's the way Florida is set up. In New Jersey, every single inch of land is incorporated. In Florida, very little is incorporated. So I live in a city. I'm in a little town, which I think you know because you told me that you have some roots in visiting Newport Richey. But Newport Richey is one of the few towns in Pasco County, which is a huge county and area. It goes from the Gulf all the way to the middle of the state. The county seat is like 40-some miles from here. And there are only, I think, 5 or 6 municipalities. All the rest is unincorporated Pasco County. So the Pasco County library system consists of libraries in unincorporated places, as well as one in Dade City, which is a county seat. And there are only 2 municipal libraries, ours in Newport Richey and the one in Zephyr Hills. So it's a whole different way. So county government is just so different. There's a lot of tension between county and town. The counties are booming and building like crazy, and it seems like the environment is like an afterthought in many cases, whereas in the cities, of course, there really isn't a lot of room to grow and everything is older and much more traditional. I call Newport Richey Metuchen with Metuchen with palm trees and a river.
Yeah.
Where I live a couple blocks from Main Street here, just like I did in Metuchen. We walk to everything, and it's really kind of nice to be in a small town living. And I'm sure that's what really attracted us was that my in-laws lived here. I'd never heard of it before, but then I fell in love with it later on. So, but then the one that I'm really most proud of the ones that I'm involved in now is the Food Advisory Policy Council. I got onto it totally by accident. I'd never been involved in anything like this before. We're involved in making policy about food access, food distribution, the various places where, and I got started by volunteering at Metropolitan Ministries, where I've gotten many people in my congregation to volunteer as well. In fact, we're supposed to go over there tomorrow. If I test negative tomorrow morning for COVID, I'll be able to go. Otherwise, I'll have to miss it this month. But where we distribute food for the needy, and of course, that's grown greatly. I mean, people who have never been poor before, due to COVID, and then the shrinking of the economy, and many of them really haven't recovered. It's made people who have were wealthy but didn't really manage their money, just spent it as it came in, suddenly became poor. And, so we're involved with that and the traditional poor as well, but also working with getting policies such as these farmers markets, getting them to accept SNAP. Food stamps, and we've done that. We have a really active farmers market that's run by the library, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
But the way I got on this council was totally by every county is required to have one. So the head librarian here is a member of the council. And in Florida, you have to have a quorum in order to meet. You can't even meet without the quorum. You just can't get together. And you must meet in person, which which makes no sense. It goes all the way back to the 19th century, before there was Zoom or any other way to meet that way. But they're enforcing it, so you have to have a quorum in person. So for whatever reason, she was not able to attend the meeting. And so she asked, I guess, the secretary of the library to call Rod and ask him to come in. So I get this call at like 8 o'clock in the morning. You have to go to the government center. Fortunately, they were meeting in Newport Richie then. Now they're meeting, they could meet anywhere in the county. We're meeting in Land O'Lakes next month. It's about 20 miles from here, but it's possible that you could meet all the way at Zephyr Hills. And I know how hard it is because there's a lot of traffic going back and forth. And the folks from Zephyr Hills really complain when they have to come to Newport Richie and vice versa. So, so I said, well, okay, I don't know anything about this, but all you have to do is show up, be her alternate. So I go to the government center and they greet me and they ask me all sorts of questions. They're really glad to see me, of course. And they happen to have a vacancy on the board. They said, God, can you join our board? It would be so great to have you, someone who cares so much and all that. So I know nothing about this. If this were libraries or history or whatever, I could. They said, it doesn't matter. You just have to have a passion for this, for making sure that people don't go hungry, that we don't have supermarket deserts and all that stuff. I said, well, okay. So, and it wasn't a really big commitment. I mean, again, we do a lot of lobbying and that kind of thing, and try to either suggest laws or influence laws, and then we're active on the streets as well. But then, so I get all the material and I take it to the librarian's office who missed the meeting. And so she calls me later on when she gets to the office, says, why did you go to the meeting? I said, well, because you told me to. So I didn't tell you to. I said, no, I got a call from the secretary who said, no, I didn't tell her to call Ron. I told her to call Rod. So that's how
So there you go. Oh my goodness.
But that's really been the most rewarding thing I've done. And as you know, I serve as the spiritual leader of the congregation. It's in Port Richey. It's the Jewish Community Center of West Pasco, Congregation Beth Tefillah. We're an older congregation. In its heyday, it had over 700 families. We have the biggest auditorium in the entire county. I think it was. We were down to 40 families and couldn't afford a rabbi. And so I stepped in as a volunteer, and I'm still doing it. And all the usual things that a rabbi would do without being a rabbi. And mostly funerals, unfortunately, and dedications of monuments and things like that. Memorial services. And we're trying to be active in that community. And I've actually done 2 weddings now. I did my most recent one just last month. So that turns out, and I didn't have to, you don't have to be ordained to conduct a wedding in Florida. You just have to be a notary. So I became a notary, but I can sign all the religious documents, and I can also now sign the official documents as well as a notary. And so I've done 2 of them now, one just before COVID and one last month. Baby namings and just all the life cycle events, as well as leading services, which since I contracted COVID, I've been doing from home, not Zoom. We do a hybrid service. We do people who are not ready to come back.
Sure.
We don't have crowds, obviously, with our small membership, but so that's been rewarding as well.
Yeah,
I'm definitely looking forward to being fired from that job, from having enough resources so that we can hire a real rabbi and I can sit back and enjoy myself.
Right.
Plus, we're raising grandchildren here as well, so it's a real interesting experience.
You're having a very
full life, yes.
Yeah.
But I do really appreciate it. I mean, I do highly recommend this kind of life because, first of all, staying active is important. But second of all, I'm able to do things pretty much on my own pace. So I can get up and take a long bike ride and have a really long breakfast, read every page of the newspaper, do the crossword puzzle and all that, and then get to work. And I've kept up a lot of the New Jersey connections. Unfortunately, MARAC has been tough because growing up there, but I do go to the Zoomed caucus meetings, most of those. And I'm still involved in the New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance. So, certain other, and of course, National History Day. I gave a paper, I guess it was during the pandemic, on the New Jersey contested election in 1838
Yes.
at the New Jersey Historical Commission. I wasn't very adept at Zoom then, and really screwed it up and had to go out of order because I couldn't get myself on where people could hear me. But I eventually did and was able to give that paper, which is something I never would have been able to do if we didn't have this. So it's a mixed blessing to be able to have this access. And like right now, we'd have to get together, which would be pretty hard for me to do in person since I'm tested positive for COVID.
Yeah.
And so we're do this. I mean, I much prefer to do it in person, but this is great to have this option. Better than not doing it at all, which would be the case.
Absolutely.
And I will be attending the MARAC meeting.
Well, that's where I was going to go next. Our big 50th in College Park, and fingers crossed that things will go well for that, and we can all meet together. I guess
my first foray into in-person MARAC meeting in many years.
But I guess that also is sort of one of my kind of wrap-up questions too, is where you see MARAC going, how you see its role moving forward, and we're changing our meetings a bit, having one in person a year, and then doing a virtual, and then also doing a meeting that's more of a workshop. Like we're going to have a DEI focused workshop coming up. So just, I don't know, any thoughts that you have on where MARAC is and going?
Well, certainly it's big now, obviously, and we have to outsource a lot of things that we never could even afford to do or even thought of doing before. So that part, that it's changed a lot that way. And, the way to get the most people to participate and make things as practical as possible, and it looks like they are going in that direction. I've been reading, the things that MARAC puts out, but I haven't been participating in the actual meeting, so I can't speak directly to a lot of that. But the general direction, as you say, having meetings devoted to workshops, I think is very important. Bring us back to our roots of having practical sessions that people can really come away, make connections, and still learn things at the same time. Some of the sessions that I really enjoyed, after I really didn't need the how-to sessions anymore, not because I was an accomplished archivist, but because I was an archival administrator and never had the time to do those things anymore. So the sessions I really loved were the ones that would document certain things, that would document, say, certain aspects of social history, of how to do this kind of collection or that kind of collection, or where there were collections, documentation strategies and how these collections came about. So that kind of thing I really enjoyed that. I would kind of look for those sessions and stay on that track. And usually they were based on the region where we were meeting, the state or the county where we were meeting. And that was fascinating too, to learn about that. But I know that it's difficult for people to travel, especially now. So it makes tremendous sense to take advantage of the technology. Of course, it saves a lot of money and all of that. Not having stayed at a MARAC hotel at a time and seeing what the Marriott price was, I was a little shocked, and I thought to myself, wow, maybe virtual meetings do have their place.
Yeah, I think so. But that.
So I'm fully confident that MARAC will continue. Won't get swallowed up by SAA. We were always worried about that, in the early days that they were going to put an end to us. Because there was talk at one point of making us like they have these committees or councils or what have you within it. There would be the Mid-Atlantic Council of SAA. It was in that way, but that never happened.
No.
I had to see MARAC, and of course many of the other regionals are doing.
Well, but my final MARAC related question, because I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this, is especially with our move to virtual and COVID and all that, the hospitality suite doesn't quite happen the way it used to. And I know it was a much vaunted tradition, and many of us have fond memories of the hospitality suite. Do you have anything you'd like to share, or maybe the origins of the hospitality?
That's where you really get to meet people. I was definitely involved in that, and that was the idea was to be able to. Many of these hotels have rules about that you have to buy their liquor and all that. So I still remember, especially when we met in New Brunswick, I think somehow that was my job to go to the bar that was next door and fill 2 suitcases full of liquor and bring them in. And I still remember going into the Hyatt in New Brunswick with these suitcases, and the bellhop person there noticed that I was struggling and wanted to help. I couldn't let him help me because I didn't want to know what was in it. No, I'm doing fine. That's where I met a lot of people and really got to know people well. One of the real dignitaries of MARAC, and who we knew for many years, the late beloved Leonard Rapport, was he would sit in that and just pontificate on his career and give us advice on all sorts of things, not just archives but life in general. That's where we got it over a drink in the hospitality room, and it was, I thought, a really great. Now, it didn't help my reputation any, because some people thought, because I organized this for a while, that this was like my thing. And I never did get drunk at any of those or any of that. In fact, I never closed any of them down. I just couldn't stay awake all night, even when I was younger. But it was a really, despite its reputation, I think it was a very valuable, and we did get in trouble in a few places. I think it might have been in Harper's Ferry that I had to leave the hospitality room for some reason, and then I came back and I got a little mixed up, and I heard kind of laughter coming from a certain place, and I went into the wrong hospitality room. I thought and they greeted me so nicely. They sat me down, what would I like to drink and all of that, and then they asked me if I was with the bride or the groom. And I had to admit that I was with the archives people. I walked in the wrong room, and they got so upset because apparently, not only the reason I couldn't find them was we got kicked out of there. We got put in a separate building. There was an outbuilding there because they were making so much noise. And so I guess archivists didn't have a very good reputation there. But in general, I think we did. I think that was a valuable addition. I don't know if they still do it or not, or how they do it. I know technically it has to be a cash bar now. They really crack down on bringing liquor into that way they can monitor it as well, of course, because you have to have a bartender when you do that. So it's probably more subdued, but I hope they still do it anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's been a while.
Look at the program, and there was something in the evening where you could get together.
I think they've tried to make it a more official.
They didn't use the word hospitality. They used
No, that was its own thing. So,
yeah.
but I think it was a way to meet a lot of people and get to know people on a different level.
That just really wonderful memories from that. So many people, and unfortunately, sadly, many of them are gone now. And Lauren Brown, of course, is trying to get people together, and we're discovering together that many of us have passed away. And of course, 50 years. You have to be pretty young, and even if you were, you're going to be in your 70s now.
Yeah.
The youngest of us are in our 70s. So time does pass, but I think MARAC will survive. Hopefully another 50 years, and maybe more. It's hard to predict what the world will be like 50 years from now. But,
Well, MARAC is surviving a pandemic, so that, it's a good sign. So
Right. So another longevity thing, and I do have somewhere here. I still have my Fobi.
the Fogi pin, yes,
I hope I remember to take it with me. When
please, yes,
just give it
please
to me.
get with you.
I was already an old fogey in 1992, so I guess I have been around for a while.
Well, but you've made enormous contributions, so we're grateful, and thank you so
Well,
much for
I'm the
sitting.
grateful one. Yeah, I'm the grateful one.
And we'll, the recording will be made available on the MARAC up on YouTube. So your stories and your recollections of MARAC and your career and your life will be there for lots of MARACers to view and listen to.
Right.
Thank you.
I would like to encourage others to do this as well, and not just archivists, but I'm going back to my retro. I'm part of the retired faculty, the Emeriti group, and Rudy Bell was our most recent chair, and he was really encouraging people. He got Sean Illingworth to do a session for us. We meet monthly the last couple of years on Zoom, and thank goodness, because I wouldn't be able to even be a part of this if it wasn't for Zoom, for many of us who no longer live in New Jersey. But Rudy made a really big push for us all to be interviewed, and he got interviewed himself. And incredibly tragically, this vibrant person, a colleague of ours for so many years, and really a mentor to me at Rutgers for a long time, passed away suddenly, so quickly after he was interviewed. It just shows you how important this is. So with that in mind, Sean is going to be interviewing me next month.
Great.
I don't know what we're going to cover, but probably similar things that we did today.
That's great. And yes, hopefully we get a whole cache of these interviews up and online. So, but I'm going to stop the recording and thank you once again for your time. And we will hopefully meet up at College Park.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you.